Just 4 minutes after stepping into the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett, a 27-year-old black woman, was slapped with a $500 fine and publicly embarrassed by a white judge, simply for wearing a small cross necklace. And this happened in the heart of Washington, D.C., supposedly the symbol of American justice. But in that moment, it became the very place where her faith and dignity were put on trial. What the judge didn't know, however, was that Jasmine wasn't just the White House press secretary. She was also a brilliant legal strategist working undercover. Would he realize the truth before the entire country erupted? At 27, most people are still searching for their purpose, but not Jasmine Crockett. She stood firm in the center of America's political turmoil, steadfast, composed. The only black woman in President Trump's administration and the youngest to ever serve as the White House press secretary in modern times. This fact alone sent shockwaves through the nation and quietly unsettled the political establishment. With her natural curls, piercing brown eyes, and a calm, deliberate presence, Jasmine never needed theatrics to prove her power. She carried herself like someone used to being doubted, dismissed, and constantly having to prove others wrong. Raised in South Dallas, where the sound of gunshots often outpowered church hymns, Jasmine was the daughter of a single mother, a pastor and a war veteran who had been wrongly imprisoned due to racial injustice. Jasmine grew up in a world of false accusations, whispered prayers, and the fear of police sirens. She learned early that being black, female, and poor meant you had to be 3 times better just to be noticed. But Jasmine chose not to stay silent. She chose to speak up. At 18, she won her state's debate championship on the First Amendment. By 22, she declined a scholarship to Harvard Law, instead enrolling at a historically black university, stating, "I want to study law among those who've suffered under it." By 25, she was already a communications advisor for a presidential campaign and stunned political insiders by crafting a speech that led to a senator's resignation within 6 hours. Jasmine wasn't someone who catered to popularity. She was the strategist that even President Trump, infamous for being hard to manage, admitted was not PR, she's pure tactics. Whenever Jasmine took the podium at the White House, every word she delivered hit with precision. The media couldn't stand her, conservatives feared her, but ordinary people, especially those marginalized by race or religion, watched her intently. To them, she was a voice that reflected their own. She didn't need to shout. Her message resonated like a thunderclap. What earned Jasmine respect wasn't just her title. It was her journey. No shortcuts, no handouts, no boving. She bulldozed through every obstacle with resilience and brilliance, and always with a small silver cross resting on the collar of her crisp white blouse. No one knew why she always wore it. Some thought it was sentimental. Others guessed it was a quiet form of protest. Jasmine never clarified. In a rare moment, when questioned, she replied, "It's not for others to notice. It's to remind me who I am, before they try to make me forget." At 27, Jasmine Crockett was a mixture of strength and youth, intellect and perseverance, conviction and hardship. She was a woman with the heart of a South Dallas child, the mind of a legal mastermind, and the resolve of someone forged in fire. She knew what it meant to be humiliated, punished for staying true to what she believed in, to be told her faith was something dangerous. But because of that, she was ready to strike when the moment was right. And today, the DC courtroom was about to become ground zero. The evening air in Washington often carried a heavy stillness, not from heat, but from the imposing, chalk-white buildings looming near the West Wing. It was here that the nation's destiny was rewritten behind sealed doors. Inside one of those rooms, Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk, having just finished her noon briefing. She peeled the sticky notes off her iPad and exhaled slowly, finally releasing some of the pressure that had built up during the day. Her office was modest, just enough space for a large desk, a single chair, a shelf stacked with legal texts, and a narrow window with a view of Lafayette Square. On her desk, beside a folder embossed with the White House seal, sat 2 items: a framed photo of her mother holding a Bible and a glass of jasmine tea. A soft breeze pushed the white curtains aside, filling the room with a temporary sense of peace. Then the phone rang. Not the standard ringtone, this was the emergency line. The blue code. Only high-level calls came through it. The light blinked. West Wing Direct. Jasmine sat up, straightening her back. She picked up the receiver. A familiar voice rasped through. "Jasmine, Mr. President." She responded quickly, voice cool and composed. "There's a case just filed in the DC District Court. A group of Christians is suing the government for being banned from praying in a public park." He paused for a moment. "I want you there. Watch closely, document everything, and report directly to me." Jasmine's brow furrowed slightly as her fingers tightened around the pen lying on her desk. "Any specific instructions, sir?"
No.
"But if anything feels off, I trust your instincts," he said. A short silence hung between them before the line went dead.
No goodbye. No reminder.
Just a directive, and an unspoken confidence placed squarely on her shoulders. Jasmine remained still for nearly a full minute, her gaze drifting toward the empty space beyond the window. The DC District Court was typically a place for civil proceedings. Minor on the surface, yet often where deep-rooted prejudice quietly settled and grew. She understood this all too well, because the unnoticed cases, the ones skipped over by headlines, were often the earliest tremors before the collapse of justice. A strange feeling stirred within her. Not fear, not excitement, something older, deeper, instinctual. Today wouldn't be ordinary. Today, her faith would be tested not by evidence, not by argument, but simply for existing. She rose and walked toward the coat rack near the door, where several neatly pressed suits hung in order like silent soldiers awaiting command. Among them, she chose her signature navy blazer, deep blue, with a high collar and delicate silver stitching along the sleeve cuffs. It was the one she reserved for important moments, and somehow she knew today required it. As she began fastening the buttons, her hand hesitated at the small silver cross pinned to the collar of her crisp white blouse. Her fingers gently touched it, almost automatically. But this time, the emotion it sparked ran deeper. It wasn't just decoration. It was her father's final gift before he passed, after years of suffering from lung complications linked to his wrongful imprisonment. Her father, Isaiah Crockett, had been a skilled mechanic. His hands, calloused and stained with grease, held a quiet kindness and a relentless hunger for justice, like a preacher who never took the pulpit. When Jasmine was a child, he would read from the Bible each night. Afterward, he'd touch the cross around his neck, whispering like a vow, "No one can take your faith away unless you take it off yourself." She was 9 years old when police wrongfully detained him for matching a suspect's description. He came home 23 days later, but the damage lingered. His spirit, his clarity, and eventually his lungs never fully healed. On the final night of his life, he removed the cross, placed it in Jasmine's small hand, and smiled. "Wear it when you need strength, and never take it off unless you've fulfilled your purpose." Since that day, Jasmine had never removed it. Not while facing press ambushes, not during tense meetings with the president, not even when political allies turned against her. The cross remained quiet and unwavering. It wasn't for anyone else's eyes. It was for her. Her faith wasn't decoration. It was foundation. But today, as she secured the cross on her collar, a strange sensation washed over her, felt warmer, almost alive, as if her father's hand had returned for just a moment, passing along silent courage. "Stay strong. Today you'll need it more than ever." Jasmine glanced into the small mirror fixed to the back of her cabinet door. Her outfit flawless, her face composed, her eyes sharp, but beneath the surface she was preparing. Not just for a mission of observation, but for something more complex, more dangerous. She nodded at her reflection. "I'm ready, Dad." Then she stepped out, carrying the cross not only as a symbol, but as a silent challenge to anyone bold enough to question someone else's faith. The sleek black SUV pulled away from the east wing of the White House. Inside, Jasmine sat in the back seat, her hand resting lightly on her knee, her eyes scanning the familiar scenery through the dark bulletproof windows. Washington, D.C. drifted past, blurring buildings she knew by heart. That afternoon, the city seemed more muted than usual. The sky hung overcast, the sunlight dim, But the streets were alive, as always. Pedestrians rushing by with wireless earpieces, congressional staffers exiting buildings with blazers slung over shoulders, and scattered protesters lifting handmade signs along the National Mall. Jasmine took it all in with a silent awareness. Still, a quiet unease sat in her chest. It wasn't about the case. She'd handled many religious freedom cases. Nor was it the unexpected call from the president. Those weren't new either. This was different. Something about today felt heavier, more deliberate, like a warning before a storm. It wasn't anxiety, it was instinct. The kind that people like Jasmine, born into a world that demanded vigilance, learned to trust. An inherited radar for when something beneath the surface was about to shift. She recalled the president's words. "I need you there. Just observe." It seemed simple, too simple, and that's what bothered her. Trump wasn't known for subtlety. If this were just another civil matter, he wouldn't send Jasmine to watch. So what exactly was she meant to observe? The judge? The plaintiffs? The justice system itself? The SUV made a turn onto Pennsylvania Avenue, driving past the United States Supreme Court, its grand columns standing tall like eternal guardians of the law. Jasmine looked up at them through the glass. The place where Americans were told justice was immortal. But she knew the truth. Law wasn't always built on logic. Sometimes it was shaped by prejudice and maintained through silence. As the vehicle jolted over a pothole, the small silver cross brushed softly against her collarbone. Jasmine grasped it, gently rubbing it with her thumb. An unconscious habit, but one that brought a sudden wave of focus. She closed her eyes for a second, then slowly opened them. What occupied her mind now wasn't the case, nor the report. It was something clearer, more vivid. Today, I'm not the outsider. I'm going to be the one drawn in. She didn't know how, and she had no idea what was coming. But with the instinct of a black woman who had been doubted in the middle of congressional hearings, interrogated by the press simply because of her skin, and told to remove her cross during an International Media Alliance conference, she knew one thing with certainty. When the system fears you, it will find a way to quiet you. And she could feel that today was going to be one of those days. As the car made a right turn onto E Street, just minutes from the DC District Court, Jasmine straightened her back. No more reclining. No more casual posture. Her hands rested calmly atop her briefcase, and her phone quietly switched into background recording mode. In her mind, she repeated the core principles of religious liberty, personal expression, and lawful presence, like a silent mantra. She didn't know why the preparation felt so urgent, but her body sensed that something awaited her inside. The DC District Court looked nothing like the public might picture when imagining a place of justice. There were no grand domes, no gleaming wooden entrances, no majestic pillars. Instead, it resembled a somber concrete block, dull and weathered with cracked, uneven steps. A low iron fence wrapped around the building, and the once white columns had faded with age and neglect. A slanted sign reading District of Columbia Superior Court hung tiredly above the entrance, casting a gloomy shadow over the scene. Jasmine stepped out of the SUV, her heels tapping sharply against the worn stone steps. Each stride was deliberate, precise, but it was the echo of those footsteps in the quiet morning that caught her attention most. At the security checkpoint, she pulled out her federal identification and showed it to the guard. He offered her a passing glance, barely acknowledging her before turning back to his screen.
No greetings.
No signs of recognition. To them, she was just another black woman in a blazer walking into the courthouse, probably dealing with some minor civil matter. Overdue rent, a petty dispute, or waiting for her name to be called. Jasmine wasn't surprised. She expected no recognition. She certainly didn't require it. She wasn't there to be seen. She wasn't there for validation or praise. She was there to observe. And as President Trump had instructed, she would carry out that order, from the shadows if she had to, blending in with the public, hidden in plain sight. The heavy courtroom door groaned as she pushed it open, the sound rippling through the quiet corridor and drawing a few curious glances. The room was modest, no more than 40 seats total. The air was thick with the smell of old photocopiers, yellowing documents, and the faint trace of cigarette smoke still clinging to the coats of older men seated in the back. Felt both crowded and hollow at once. A space filled with people yet lacking intention, as if they weren't seeking justice, but merely waiting for time to pass. Jasmine made her way down the aisle to the middle rows. Not too close to stand out, not too far to miss anything. She selected a seat in the center, optimal for watching, perfect for remaining unnoticed. Setting her briefcase beside her on the floor, she pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. No Wi-Fi needed. No images, no recordings. This wasn't about collecting proof, it was about absorbing, listening, observing. No one gave her a second look. No one paid attention to the woman in the sharp navy blazer, the same woman who had once served as the White House press secretary, who had addressed millions, sparred with reporters on Fox News, and debated senators with calm precision. No one noticed the woman who, just a week earlier, had so thoroughly dismantled a Reuters correspondent in a live interview that the station was forced to cut the broadcast early. In this room, she was invisible, just another face among many. Next to her, an older man slowly flipped through a stack of divorce papers with methodical hands. In front of her, a woman in a red sequined faux fur coat argued quietly with her attorney. The energy in the room was chaotic but sluggish, a mess of murmurs, rustling papers, and the low hum of frustration. The air felt still. The conversations around her were more like static than substance. It was the kind of atmosphere found in places where people had stopped expecting justice. They just wanted to get in and get out and forget it all as soon as they left. Jasmine observed them all, the man, the woman, the lawyer, even the judge. She watched their movements, listened to their whispers, noted the tension in their shoulders and the expressions on their faces. But it dawned on her then, no one was watching her. No one saw her, not even once. Not one person noticed the poised, resolute woman who had once stood at the highest podium in the country. Not one saw the woman who had defied the media storm with grace, who had carried her father's legacy, her faith, and her power without apology. Here, in this courtroom, Jasmine was no one, and that, she thought, was exactly the way it needed to be. She was invisible in this room, just another black woman seated in a crowded, lifeless courtroom, waiting for a case to begin. She was a shadow, a quiet presence among others who weren't there seeking justice, but merely waiting for resolution, for escape from the monotony. And that was what made her dangerous. Jasmine unlocked her phone, its screen lighting up to reveal a blank page in her Notes app. She had intended to record every small moment of the hearing, to report back in full later. But before she could type even a single word, what captured her attention didn't come from the judge's bench. It came from the people surrounding her. Just 2 seats to her left, a white man in his 40s wore a black t-shirt with large, white lettering that read, "I am king." Beneath the words, there was an image of a lion wearing a golden crown. The shirt's neckline dipped low enough to expose a skull tattoo inked onto his neck. He sat with his legs sprawled, one arm thrown casually across the seat in front of him, loudly chewing gum and occasionally snorting, as if making a point of drawing attention. His eyes swept across the room with a smirk, a twisted grin that suggested contempt for everyone in sight. To Jasmine's right, a middle-aged white woman with fiery red hair and long, sparkling blue nails wore a bright silver faux leather jacket. But even more noticeable were the chains draped around her neck, at least 5 layers of gaudy rhinestone necklaces that caught the light like a disco ball. Each time she leaned over to speak to her attorney, the chains jingled loudly, echoing through the air like wind chimes on a sweltering summer day. Jasmine wasn't judging them. She didn't care about their outfits. But what made her pause, what struck her like a sudden chill, was that no one had said a word to them. Not a single person asked them to adjust their clothing. No security personnel approached. No court clerk sent even a disapproving glance their way. Everything they wore, every sound they made, was treated as entirely acceptable. She slowly turned her head and surveyed the room. Several others were dressed just as casually. Some wore baseball caps. Others had t-shirts with anti-government slogans. A few even had wireless earbuds tucked in, despite the sign at the entrance that clearly read, "No electronic devices beyond this point." Then she glanced down at herself. The navy blazer was buttoned neatly to her collar. The crisp white shirt beneath it, flawlessly ironed. Black dress pants, cleanly pressed. No flashy accessories, only the small silver cross pinned modestly at her neckline. Everything was proper. Everything was according to the rules. And she knew, if anyone were to be called out that day, it wouldn't be the man in the I am king shirt. It wouldn't be the woman jangling like a chandelier. It would be her, because she was quiet, because she was poised, because she was Jasmine Crockett, a black woman, highly educated, respected, principled, and that, in a space where power so often crushed the powerless, made her a threat. No one spoke aloud, but injustice lurked in the air, like a snake in the grass, coiled in the silence of the courtroom, slithering through the indifference of those who refused to see it. And Jasmine began to understand. She hadn't come here just to observe. She was already part of a trial, and no one had even read the charges. The wooden door behind the judge's bench creaked open. A small sound, but one that carried weight. No voices announced his arrival. No words marked the moment. But the mood in the room shifted instantly, as if the entire courtroom inhaled at once and held its collective breath. A few people rose quickly, reacting to an unspoken rule. Others remained seated, confused or uninterested. Then, cutting through the tension, a firm voice rang out from a court security officer. "All rise." Jasmine rose immediately, as if on cue. Her posture was perfect, straight as a rod. Others followed, some slower, some with less certainty. But Jasmine's eyes, sharp and practiced, locked onto the opening door. There he was, stepping out with controlled, deliberate strides, the man who would preside over today's events. Charles Hargrove. Each of his footsteps echoed on the wooden floor with chilling accuracy. They sounded less like steps and more like a warning. Charles Hargrove, 62. A white man, his silver hair slicked back, glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. His facial features were sharp and cold, unmoving, almost chiseled from granite. His black judicial robe was immaculate, stiff, and perfectly pressed, devoid of any warmth or human softness. It looked like something that had never been touched by emotion. It was a robe of finality, a robe of command, a robe that did not bend, just like the man who wore it. He didn't glance at the crowd, as most judges would. There was no polite expression.
No respectful nod.
No acknowledgement of the lawyers or court staff. With an air of entitlement, he walked directly to his bench. He placed the case folders on the desk with quiet precision, his fingers briefly skimming over the papers as he adjusted his glasses. Then he looked up and began scanning the room. It wasn't a casual glance. His eyes moved slowly, methodically over the courtroom, evaluating, sorting, silently measuring each person like an object to be filed away. His gaze passed over the man in the I am king shirt. Nothing. It slid past the woman layered in glittering rhinestone jewelry. No reaction. He saw the three middle-aged men wearing shorts and sleeveless shirts, their casual clothes clashing harshly with the stiff air of the courtroom. Not even a flicker. And then his eyes stopped. They locked onto the center row, right on Jasmine Crockett. Still, upright, unshaken, unflinching. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The noise of the room, the faint shuffling of papers, the soft murmur of conversations, faded into the distance. No words were spoken, but Jasmine felt it deep within her core. It was as though his stare was stripping away every layer of her identity. Her position, her education, her confidence, her calm. It wasn't just a glance. It was an unspoken interrogation, a silent dissection of everything she embodied. His eyes were cold and piercing, examining her as if she were an unfamiliar object he had no intention of understanding. It felt like he had already formed a judgment without evidence, without even a shred of doubt. His expression silently declared, "I know exactly who you are, and I don't like your kind." Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't avert her gaze. Her body remained steady, composed, her eyes locked with his, refusing to waver. She recognized that look. She had seen it before, in executive offices where men like him made the decisions, in rooms filled with white men who shaped policies, wrote laws, and determined whose voices mattered. She had seen it in the press, when reporters ignored her work and focused instead on her race, as if her accomplishments could never stand on their own. She had felt it in the eyes of police officers reflected in rearview mirrors, eyes that presumed she didn't belong in the car she drove, that her presence was out of place purely because of her skin. It was the gaze of power, power that didn't like to be questioned, that didn't accept resistance, and that didn't bend. And now Jasmine was its target. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she dared to exist in a place where people like her weren't expected. She stayed still, knowing this wasn't a random glance. It was a challenge, not to her intellect, not to her capabilities, but to her very presence. A test of her worth, of her dignity, of the principles she stood for. But she remained upright, aware that power had chosen this moment to try and crush her. She had been here before, where verdicts were decided before her voice was heard, where others like her were dismissed simply for being different. But this time, she wouldn't be silenced. Jasmine Crockett didn't back down. Her spine stayed straight, her eyes steady. She knew this wasn't just a courtroom. It was a battlefield, and she was prepared. The cross is not permitted in this courtroom. His voice sliced through the air, sudden, loud, and sharp. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound, toward her. For a second, the room went completely still. Not because people didn't comprehend what he had just said, but because the accusation was so outrageous, it shocked them into silence. Jasmine hadn't uttered a word since she walked in. She hadn't shifted, hadn't made a sound. She hadn't even touched the simple silver cross at her collar, a quiet, dignified symbol resting gently on her crisp white shirt. And yet, that single, small cross was enough for Judge Charles Hargrove to declare her a disruption. A woman draped in chains so large they jingled with every move? Not a problem. A man sporting a loud, "I am King" shirt and sprawled in his seat? No issue. But Jasmine, the only black woman in the courtroom, dressed professionally, silent and respectful, was called out for wearing a small religious emblem. She didn't move, but her chest tightened with a familiar, suffocating pressure. The ache of being singled out not for something she had done, but for who she was. No one came to her defense. Not a word. Just hesitant glances, drooping heads, and the soft tapping of someone's fingers on a wooden bench, steady and tense, like the lead-in to a haunting song. Hargrove stood above on his high platform, his face as emotionless as carved marble. His eyes locked on hers, unblinking. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was calculated. And even though she had done nothing wrong, Jasmine had just been branded. He didn't need to say it. The room understood. She was the problem. Facing the sea of eyes, Jasmine Crockett felt the air grow dense around her. Everyone was staring. Not because she had spoken out, not because she had disrespected the court, but simply because she wore a cross. Hargrove didn't reprimand the man in the bold shirt, legs splayed and gum popping. He didn't call out the woman dripping in glittering necklaces, chatting away between hearings. But he had no problem raising his voice for Jasmine, as if she'd broken some cardinal rule. It hit her again, that bitter sensation, the feeling of being treated like a threat just for existing with composure. Her fingers curled around her phone inside her bag. Slowly, she stood. Each step she took toward the bench was firm, intentional. Her heels struck the wooden floor with a steady rhythm, loud in the hush of bigotry. She didn't bow her head. She didn't lash out. But every step declared, "I'm not afraid of you." And in her mind, a sharp truth rang out. This wasn't about rules. This was about humiliation. Public, strategic, powerful. And Jasmine knew, if she stayed silent now, it would only open the door for countless others to be silenced tomorrow, under the guise of courtroom decorum. The tension thickened. The atmosphere in the courtroom was taut, like a drawn bowstring, as Jasmine stood before the judge's bench. Her eyes met Judge Charles Hargrove's, steady, unwavering, neither dropping nor diverting, yet not defiant. It was the look of someone well-versed in confronting authority and equally familiar with how that authority attempts to silence those who refuse to shrink. A part of her burned to speak out, to lash back, but she knew that even the smallest display of emotion could be twisted into an accusation of disorder. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself, and spoke, each syllable intentional, calm, and precise. Your Honor, I am here under direct instruction from the President of the United States. A hushed stir passed over the benches, soft murmurs of, the President? As if only now realizing that the quiet black woman standing confidently before them was not some nameless visitor. I've been assigned to observe a case pertaining to religious liberty.
No involvement. No advocacy.
No interference, Jasmine continued, her gaze firmly locked with the judge's frosty eyes atop the bench. The cross I am wearing, her hand touched her chest, where the small silver emblem rested, is a personal keepsake. It was my late father's last possession, and also a symbol of my faith. She paused briefly, letting the words settle. Then her voice rose, more resolute. That symbol is undeniably safeguarded by the U.S. Constitution under the First Amendment. I do not wear it to persuade anyone in this courtroom. I wear it to remind myself of who I am. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried the quiet gravity of someone who had endured far too much injustice to mistake silence for peace. She knew that decency and justice only mattered when someone stood up for them, even when standing alone. Judge Hargrove's eyes narrowed. He didn't answer right away. His fingers gripped the gavel, tapping it softly on the desk. Not with purpose, but out of habit. It was what he did when something took him by surprise and he wanted to hide it. Tension clung to the room. The man in the I Am King shirt shifted upright. The woman with the chandelier-sized necklace glanced at Jasmine for the first time, her expression shifting, as if realizing Jasmine was not just another official. But Jasmine ignored them. She stood firm, her hand gently pressed over the cross like an anchor in the middle of a storm. Because those words weren't just a defense. They were a signal, a warning to the room and the system itself. I will not be silenced. I know the law, and I will not bow to unjust power. A second after Jasmine finished, a haunting stillness gripped the room. Time itself seemed to slow. Judge Hargrove's glare sharpened. This was no longer his usual cold gaze. It carried the edge of being challenged in a space where he was used to absolute control. His arm moved slowly, deliberately.
No canceltaschen.
No weighing of rights or law. The gavel slammed. Thud. The sound hit like a sentence. I don't need you lecturing me about the law, Ms. Crockett. His voice cut through the silence. Harsh, unpolished, lingering in the air like an insult. You are disrupting the neutrality of this courtroom. Religious symbols, no matter how small, can impact the mindset of those present. As a government official, bringing personal beliefs into this space is unacceptable. He paused, his lips curling slightly as though pleased with the ruling. Like this was the outcome he had been aiming for all along. I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court. A quiet wave of shock rippled across the courtroom. No one spoke, but the room reacted. A young man's brow furrowed. An older black woman in the last row leaned forward slightly. The court stenographer, her gray-streaked hair tied into a neat bun, stopped typing. Her eyes rose from the keyboard, disbelief frozen on her face. Jasmine didn't move. Her body remained composed, but her eyes darkened. Not out of fear, but from that familiar sting. The kind that comes when a system bends reason just enough to oppress. It wasn't about the money. The $500 was meaningless. What cut deep was the implication that in a place called a court of justice, a woman could be fined simply for wearing a small symbol of her belief. It wasn't the first time Jasmine had heard of such cases, but it was the first time she was the one being punished. Not because she had broken a rule, but because she had the courage to speak the truth, to act with integrity, without asking permission. Judge Hargrove gave her one last glance, then nodded slightly, as if brushing aside a nuisance. He turned back to the files in front of him, as though Jasmine were no more than a line to be erased. But what he didn't realize, he had just awakened a lioness. After Judge Hargrove imposed the $500 fine, an uneasy, almost suffocating quiet swept through the courtroom. The air hung heavy. The echo of the gavel still reverberated in the minds of everyone present. No one spoke. All eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, witnesses to something they couldn't believe was happening in a place that claimed to represent fairness. An elderly man with snow-white hair seated in the last row leaned toward the person next to him and murmured, "Just for a cross? She's fined?" His voice was soft, but the words rippled like a spark in dry grass. More eyes turned toward Jasmine, then quickly turned away, nervous, unsure. A few people lowered their gazes. Others hesitated, phones quietly lifted, thumbs tapping screens as silent records of injustice began to form. Though no one had openly admitted they were recording, it became obvious that discontent was spreading, not just within Jasmine's chest, but throughout the room. Those present had witnessed a blatant abuse of authority and a stark injustice unraveling before their very eyes. Jasmine remained composed, unhurried and unshaken. She scanned the room. Not every expression mirrored the cold detachment of Judge Hargrove's. In fact, she recognized surprise, even confusion, in several faces. They didn't know how to respond. They didn't have the words. A courtroom proceeding had transformed into a biased and unjust display of power, and quietly, people began to wonder, is this what justice looks like? Suddenly, a man in his 50s, dressed sharply in a dark blazer, rose from his seat. His eyes first locked onto Judge Hargrove, then turned to Jasmine, offering a look that was both empathetic and unmistakably filled with indignation. The entire space fell into a heavy stillness. No one could predict his next move, but the question surfaced in Jasmine's mind. Would anyone speak up for her? Would someone acknowledge that she wasn't wrong? This was the precise reason Jasmine often felt the sharp sting of isolation. In such moments, the one being targeted, humiliated, or silenced wasn't merely an individual. They represented the countless others who had endured the same, and those watching, consciously or not, understood that if someone like her stood up today, one day they might need to rise for themselves as well. The courtroom remained muted, yet every breath felt weighted. Jasmine sensed the pressure around her intensifying, like an invisible vice closing in. But she would not surrender. She had already made her choice. No matter the outcome, she would not be silenced. As the heavy stillness continued, Jasmine Crockett stood still. She didn't shout, nor did she raise her hands in protest. Yet within, something powerful was rising, a resolve too strong to suppress. "I will not let injustice silence me." What stirred inside her wasn't panic or rage. It was the unmistakable ache of having her principles and beliefs trampled in the very place where they should have been protected. She exhaled slowly. Her left hand remained over the silver cross resting on her chest, while her right hand reached into her handbag, quietly activating her phone's voice recorder. No one around her noticed. She didn't need dramatic gestures. She didn't need volume. She needed proof not just for herself, but for those who would someday stand where she now stood. Under Judge Hargrove's stern gaze, Jasmine remained unflinching, calm, steady, collected. She knew that, maybe not today, but at some point, everything taking place in this courtroom would have to come to light. All the intimidation, the prejudice, the silence, it would have to be exposed. The recording wasn't just documentation for a future hearing. It was an act of resistance. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper, every echo of the gavel, captured. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself. She was fighting for every silenced voice in rooms like this one across the country. That conviction grew stronger with every passing second. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't someone who would bow to injustice. She was a Black woman, resilient, grounded, and unwilling to let this moment pass unnoticed. The cross she wore wasn't merely a religious emblem. It was strength. It was legacy. It was the foundation of her spirit. And even with shame cast upon her, she would rise above it, recording every detail, ensuring she would not be erased by this system. Judge Hargrove's stare never broke, but Jasmine sensed something new behind his eyes. Hesitation, perhaps even fear. He had underestimated her. He had expected submission, not defiance. What he hadn't anticipated was the storm she had just awakened. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the beginning of a reckoning, not only for her, but for everyone ever marginalized by a system designed to exclude them. The tension in the courtroom thickened. The only sound was the soft, repetitive tapping of Judge Hargrove's gavel. Jasmine remained centered among the people, but she no longer felt burdened by their eyes. The weight they once held had shifted. She felt like the only one truly present, while the rest drifted, led by unjust norms and distorted power. She inhaled deeply, squaring her shoulders. She wouldn't retreat. She wouldn't hesitate. Every movement toward the bench was deliberate, every step a statement. She was not only defending her rights, she was honoring the pain of generations before her. Even fined $500, even without knowing how this fight would end. One truth remained. She would not be quiet. Jasmine advanced with steady purpose, her eyes never straying from Judge Hargrove. The rest of the courtroom watched her closely. They waited for a word, for an action, for the spark they sensed would change everything. Stopping just in front of the judge's bench, Jasmine stood upright. She neither bowed her head in submission nor raised her chin in defiance. She didn't try to soften her stance. There was no need. She was about to speak, not in protest, but in principle. "Your Honor," she began, her tone clear and intentional, each syllable measured and unmistakable. "I will pay the fine, but I must ask you one thing, for your own conscience." The silence that followed was thick. All attention turned to her. Even those in the back of the courtroom leaned forward. It was obvious that what she was about to say wasn't casual. It was a challenge, a quiet demand for truth. "The cross that you consider inappropriate," Jasmine continued, her voice firm yet subdued, "is not just a trinket. It is belief. It is identity. It is justice. If you can penalize me for wearing a symbol of my faith, then I ask you, look again. Is it not you who is violating what you swore to uphold? Justice and personal freedom." A thick silence settled in the room, broken only by a faint sigh from somewhere in the back. Another voice began to murmur, but Jasmine paid no attention. Her gaze remained fixed on Judge Hargrove, whose cold and commanding expression was now showing subtle cracks of uncertainty. Judge Hargrove didn't reply at once. He remained still, gripping his gavel tightly, lips pressed together in a tense line, as if internally weighing the moment. Jasmine could see he was starting to falter. Someone like him, so long shielded by authority and status, wasn't used to facing moral challenges, especially not from someone he likely underestimated. What frustrated Jasmine wasn't the monetary penalty, it was the blatant disregard for the very principles the Constitution promised to protect. She had committed no wrongdoing, and she refused to back down until justice was properly acknowledged. The air in the courtroom remained thick with anticipation, yet no one dared to speak. Each beat of Jasmine's heart felt deliberate, like a rhythmic call to remain composed, silent but unwavering. But now was not the time for silence. She could not allow this injustice to pass without resistance. Though her words still lingered in the air, Jasmine knew she needed to make her position undeniable. She had to make Judge Charles Hargrove truly see her, not just as a defiant figure, but as someone grounded in knowledge and authority. With calm determination, she reached into her bag and retrieved her White House identification. Not hastily, but with intentional precision. The glossy badge caught the overhead light, drawing eyes across the courtroom. With quiet confidence, she placed it on the judge's desk, in full view of all present. "You should know more about who I am," Jasmine said, not raising her voice, but projecting each word with clarity and weight. "I'm Jasmine Crockett, the White House press secretary, and the woman you just disrespected is not simply a private citizen. I'm someone who understands the law more than you might believe." Her voice sliced through the silence like thunder. Subtle shifts echoed around the room, people turning, adjusting, reevaluating. No longer was she seen as just a lone black woman facing the bench. She stood now as a symbol of defiance, strength, and above all, real power. not just through her position, but through her deep comprehension of the law. Judge Hargrove's posture tensed, his hand pausing mid-motion as though awakening from a long slumber. His eyes narrowed toward the ID, then returned to Jasmine, now marked with a trace of suspicion and something else, fear. A flicker of unease that perhaps he hadn't felt in all his years on the bench. Still, Jasmine remained rooted. Her hands were steady, her voice unwavering, her expression cool yet resolute. She knew this was a pivotal moment, where everything could shift, not only for her, but for every person whose rights had been trampled by a broken system. "I understand the law better than you realize," she continued, her tone calm yet forceful. "And I refuse to allow a judge with unchecked authority to act irrationally without facing accountability." These weren't empty words. They were a bold declaration, delivered not just for the judge, but for everyone within earshot. This confrontation was no longer personal, it was a stand for justice itself. Jasmine would not retreat, especially not when she stood firmly rooted in truth and legal integrity. A tense atmosphere cloaked the courtroom. No one moved, but within the stillness, the awareness deepened. The people now understood she wasn't just a government official. She was a fighter, and her fight had only just begun. The silence was so profound, each breath could be heard clearly. Jasmine Crockett didn't just stand tall. She stood ready, braced for whatever resistance might follow. Judge Hargrove remained seated, his stare locked on her, as if searching for a weakness to exploit. But Jasmine gave him none. She knew this moment was about proving that justice must stand above personal bias or emotion. "Your Honor," Jasmine said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension, controlled and deliberate. "I would like to cite a key precedent that I believe directly supports the religious freedom I am currently exercising." Judge Hargrove's brow furrowed, but he stayed silent. Jasmine pressed on without hesitation. "In the case of Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah, 1993, the U.S. Supreme Court held that laws targeting religious practices without valid justification are unconstitutional, specifically prohibiting expressions of faith, like wearing a religious symbol, cannot be based on personal discomfort or disagreement. There must be a genuine public interest at stake." She paused to draw a breath, feeling her words grow stronger with each syllable. The courtroom stayed frozen, all attention centered on her. Only the echo of her citation lingered in the air. "Your Honor, the law does not exist to protect personal opinions. It exists to defend the rights of all citizens, regardless of their faith. You cannot penalize me for simply wearing something that represents my belief. I've harmed no one. I carry a symbol of my faith, and that right is secured by the Constitution." Each sentence struck with clarity, slicing through the icy weight of judicial authority and detachment. Around her, the spectators seemed to hold their breath. They knew that what Jasmine had said went beyond law. It was a direct challenge to years of prejudice. Judge Hargrove didn't answer right away. His face, once rigid and expressionless, began to show cracks of discomfort. He tried to maintain his stern demeanor, but his eyes betrayed a deepening doubt. Clearly, he hadn't foreseen Jasmine's bold legal counter, backed not by volume or emotion, but by precedent and constitutional truth. She hadn't taken this stand merely for herself. She had spoken for all those silenced in courtrooms like this one, people buried under the weight of injustice. Jasmine Crockett was not someone who would surrender, certainly not because she was a woman, nor because of her race, nor because she stood alone. She had spoken truth, and now this courtroom, and this judge, had no choice but to face it. She held his gaze, not allowing him to deflect or ignore what she had just said. For her, this moment wasn't simply about a personal slight. It was about the violation of the very ideals justice was meant to uphold. "Your Honor," she said once more, her hand pointed toward the man wearing the "I am King" shirt, lounging back in his seat with a smug smile on his face. "You haven't mentioned him," she said. The courtroom fell into complete silence as eyes from every corner of the room shifted to the man in the "I am King" shirt. His arrogant posture, the loud chewing of gum, all until now ignored. Yet Jasmine, a black woman in a white shirt with a small cross hanging around her neck, was fined and criticized for an utterly harmless religious symbol. She did not stop. Her gaze never left Judge Hargrove's, and her voice remained calm but filled with determination, as if slicing through every thin layer of power and prejudice. "And me," she said, her finger pointing to the silver cross that gleamed under the courtroom light. "This is considered a disruption?" She paused, her eyes locked with his. "You're telling me that my faith, my respect for personal values, is a threat to justice?" Her final words weren't a question. They were a clear declaration. For Jasmine, the issue wasn't about the religious symbol itself. It was the discrimination, the way people were judged based on outward appearances, and the inequality disguised as justice. Judge Hargrove's gaze no longer held the same sharpness. Instead, it softened as if he had been confronted by something he could not easily dismiss. He had assumed he could silence any dissent with his authority, but Jasmine had shown him that some truths cannot be hidden, even when they come from a black woman standing alone before the system. She held her unwavering stance. "You cannot make my personal faith a crime," she continued. "And if you fail to see this injustice, then you are the one corrupting justice, not me." The courtroom fell eerily quiet, as though an invisible crack had appeared in the room. All eyes turned to Judge Hargrove, waiting for his response. Some began to whisper, and a few discreetly pulled out their phones to record. But everyone knew that what was happening here wasn't a typical confrontation. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for freedom. Jasmine didn't need to wait any longer. She had said everything that needed to be said. Now, all she had to do was remain firm, because she knew that no matter the obstacles, justice would eventually prevail. Judge Hargrove sat in silence, his face pale with confusion. The unasked questions became clearer in his expression. Jasmine Crockett didn't know what he was feeling, but from the look in his eyes, she knew he had never faced anyone like her before. She didn't flinch, didn't allow herself to be distracted. She stood there, resolute, her hands still gripping the White House ID. Her eyes remained unshaken, her voice steady, like a sentence waiting to be delivered. Finally, Hargrove spoke, his voice strained as though trying to regain control that had slipped from him. I will retract the fine," he said, but his words seemed as though they weren't truly his, but the words of someone trying to escape the truth. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She stood still, but each word she spoke cut through the moment with power, exposing the weakness he had just revealed. "If you retract because of who I am," she said, her tone calm but sharp, "you are even more wrong." She paused for emphasis. "This is no longer about the personal." Her words were not just a rejection. They were a warning, a statement of truth that justice could not be manipulated to favor those in power. She wouldn't accept a change in the decision simply because she stood before the bench. She didn't need Judge Hargrove to believe that just because she came from the White House or held power, he should reverse his ruling. This wasn't personal. She was fighting for justice, for what was right, and for the freedoms of every individual, regardless of who they were. She continued to stare straight at Judge Hargrove, unflinching. "If you retract the fine because of who I am," she said again, "you're not just wronging me. You are wronging all those who cannot stand up for themselves." The courtroom was silent again, a suffocating feeling spreading through the room. The air seemed heavier, but it was Jasmine who made that silence meaningful. She wasn't just facing Judge Hargrove. She was confronting a blind system of power, and with every word she spoke, she forced it to listen, to reevaluate itself. She wasn't afraid, and she wasn't confused. This wasn't about her, it was about truth and justice. Immediately after the trial ended, a video capturing every tense moment between Jasmine and Judge Hargrove began circulating across social media platforms. It didn't take long before the hashtag crossing court unexpectedly exploded, quickly reaching the top spot nationwide. Jasmine's unwavering stand in the courtroom, refusing to yield to injustice, especially her bold words, became a symbol for those fighting for religious freedom. The video was not just evidence of injustice within the courtroom. It became a silent protest that drew millions of views and shares. People from all over the country, urban and rural, started reacting strongly, sharing their own stories of discrimination and fines for simply expressing their faith. Jasmine's story was no longer just her own. It had transformed into a symbol for the movement to protect religious freedom. The media quickly picked up on the story. Jasmine's name was making headlines, and she soon became a hero in the eyes of those who believed in the principles of freedom and justice. Within days, her story spread beyond the Christian community and reached other religious groups. Thousands of people began sharing their own experiences of being fined for expressing their faith in public spaces, particularly within courtrooms. A woman from Michigan posted a video about being fined for wearing a hijab when entering a courtroom. A man from Ohio shared his account of being summoned to court for wearing a rosary. These stories continued to flood in, highlighting a larger issue: religious discrimination in courts and public institutions. People began to realize that this wasn't an isolated event but a widespread problem that demanded urgent attention. From online groups to local workshops, religious organizations started organizing discussions and advocacy for justice. Clergy members and social activists alike called for change. The dissatisfaction continued to grow, and millions found strength in Jasmine's story. The support for Jasmine Crockett wasn't confined to religious communities. It reached politicians as well. In a bold move, President Donald Trump tweeted his support for Jasmine. Jasmine Crockett, the legal warrior who taught a biased judge a lesson in freedom. Her actions are a symbol for the protection of our religious freedoms. Justice cannot be distorted. We stand with her. The president's tweet quickly garnered millions of likes and shares, amplifying the story across media channels and among voters. His endorsement sparked a political wave, propelling Jasmine's story to new heights. She was no longer just a figure in a courtroom debate. She had become a symbol of defending freedom and justice in modern American society. Less than a week after the incident, the D.C. Judicial Council called an emergency session to investigate Judge Hargrove's actions. Court employees provided solid evidence of his discriminatory behavior, including multiple instances where he had fined individuals merely for wearing crosses, hijabs, or other religious symbols in the courtroom. A detailed report was presented to the council, showing that Judge Hargrove had fined Christians more frequently than any other religious group, with fines twice as high as those for typical offenses. Court staff also reported that Hargrove frequently set arbitrary rules and abused his power to impose unjust fines for religious symbols. This was no longer just an internal investigation. It had become a major challenge to the D.C. judicial system and a probe into religious bias within U.S. courts. A few days after Jasmine Crockett's case became a national topic, she joined a national press conference with reporters from major news outlets. The bright lights, the rapid-fire questions about the incident, about Judge Hargrove's actions, and about the changes needed in the justice system filled the room. Jasmine stepped up to the podium, dressed in simple yet powerful attire. All eyes were on her. She wasn't a Hollywood star nor a politician seeking votes. She was a woman who stood up not just for herself, but for all those who couldn't speak for themselves. When the microphone was brought closer, Jasmine stared into the camera, her voice steady, without a hint of wavering. "I didn't stand up to be famous," she said, each word emphasized. "I stood up because silence is killing justice. We can no longer overlook these injustices. Silence is complicity, and I will not be a part of it." Her words weren't just a speech, they were a call to action. People from various communities, different religious backgrounds, and those fighting for religious freedom felt the power of her words. She wasn't just speaking the truth. She was leading a movement that couldn't be stopped. The pressure from public opinion continued to rise. Just 1 week after Jasmine's press conference, Judge Hargrove, the man who had once harshly fined her, was finally forced to admit his wrongdoing. Under the scrutiny of the D.C. Judicial Council's investigation, he resigned. However, what made this situation more notable was that he publicly announced he would enroll in a training program on religious freedom and rights. This move, however, wasn't met with unanimous support. Some in the public saw it as genuine repentance and a necessary step to right his wrongs. But many others were skeptical, believing that he made this decision only to save his career, not because he truly understood the gravity of his actions. Public opinion was sharply divided. Genuine remorse or career preservation? That became the question circulating on social media and news outlets. Some believed Hargrove was trying to salvage his career, while others saw this as an opportunity for him to genuinely learn and understand the importance of religious freedom, something he had previously disregarded. The DC Judicial Council couldn't remain idle in the face of the strong public outcry and the gathered evidence. They began investigating all cases handled by Judge Hargrove, along with other judges in the area who had shown signs of bias. The results were shocking. 3 other judges were also found to have exhibited similar behavior, harshly fining individuals displaying religious symbols. Particularly Christians, these investigations uncovered an uncomfortable truth. The court system wasn't just unjust but deeply biased, as evidenced by how individuals expressing their faith were treated in courtrooms. These judges, despite having the authority to decide the fates of many, failed to understand and respect the religious freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution. This was a turning point in Jasmine's battle. It was no longer just about her. Now, the judicial system had to confront its own failings. These investigations weren't only a response to her case, but a signal that society was evolving. The My Faith, My Right movement continued to grow across the United States. People from all walks of life, of all ethnicities and religions, began to join the cause, not just for religious freedom, but because they could no longer tolerate such injustices. Pictures of people wearing crosses, hijabs, rosaries, and other religious symbols flooded social media. People didn't just post pictures. They wrote powerful declarations. "I will not be silent anymore." This slogan became the rallying cry of the movement, a reminder that silence was not an option when justice was being challenged. Those joining the movement knew that if they didn't take a stand, these injustices would persist. Jasmine Crockett wasn't merely the founder of this movement. She became a symbol of courage, of never accepting the suppression of personal faith. With each step she took, the entire nation was learning how to stand up. In the quiet space of the White House office, Jasmine Crockett stood before a large desk. Beside her was a simple photo frame containing a $500 fine receipt. It wasn't there out of anger or pain, but because of its deep significance. It was a milestone, a symbol of a fight that had been anything but easy, but one she would not back down from. She hung the receipt not to harbor resentment, but to commemorate the day justice was rekindled, the day that injustice was confronted and ultimately held accountable. This receipt wasn't just a fine. It was a reminder not to let silence bury one's rights and faith. Jasmine gazed at the receipt one last time, silently reminding herself that, despite all the struggles, she had never wavered from her goal. Even in the face of greater challenges, she would never forget the value of justice and freedom. A week later, Jasmine received a letter from a young law student. The letter read, "You made me realize that law is not just paper. It's a weapon when used correctly." These words made her pause, and she felt her faith in the cause she had been fighting for reignite. She had not only changed the justice system but had also transformed how people viewed the power of law. Jasmine realized that her actions had sparked a new belief in justice. Not a justice distorted or abused, but true justice that would protect all citizens, regardless of race or religion. Reading the letter, she smiled. A small fire was igniting in the next generation, and Jasmine had sparked that fire. Change had started in Washington, D.C., but it didn't stop there. A week later, Congress passed a new law. No one can be banned from wearing religious symbols unless it disrupts the peace. This law was the result of Jasmine's tireless advocacy and the support of the My Faith, My Right movement. States like Texas, Florida, and Ohio began amending their laws to ensure people could express their faith without facing discrimination or punishment. This was a major victory, not just for Christians, but for all religious groups in the country. Religious symbols were no longer viewed as an invasion or threat. They were now seen as an essential part of the nation's diversity. Jasmine's movement had become a symbol of great change. What had started as a personal struggle had evolved into a nationwide fight. Justice was no longer a theoretical concept, it had been realized. Jasmine's story didn't remain confined to the borders of the United States. She was invited to speak at the United Nations, where nations and communities from all over the world were watching. With confidence, she stood before representatives from over 100 countries, speaking about religious freedom and the protection of personal faith. One person, one symbol, one well-timed statement can shake the entire system, Jasmine said, her voice echoing in the meeting room, not just as the words of one woman, but as the voice of a movement changing the world. She wasn't just representing the oppressed. She was representing all those who believed in the value of freedom, the freedom not just to live, but to believe in what is right. Her words made the world stop and rethink how they were handling religious freedom in their societies. The final scene of the story shows Jasmine standing on the White House balcony, a place where she had witnessed the country's transformation. She looked toward the sunset, where the soft golden light reflected off the small cross around her neck. It wasn't just a symbol of faith. It was a symbol of the battle she had fought, not only for her own freedom, but for the freedom of everyone. Freedom doesn't come easily, she whispered to herself, feeling each word like a promise. A commitment to always keep the flame alive for those who would follow. Jasmine had not only changed the world, but she had inspired a new generation. One that would continue to fight to protect freedom, not just for themselves, but for all. She stood there, unwavering, not just as a victor, but as someone who had ignited the flame of hope for a more just society. Jasmine Crockett had not just fought for herself. She had become a symbol of justice, religious freedom, and hope. Her story would be remembered for a long time as a fire that never dies in the hearts of all those who believe in the power of change. Jasmine Crockett's story had ended, but the fight for justice and freedom would continue.